Hi, everyone. It's Caroline here, and welcome to this week's podcast. In case we haven't met already, I've spent more than 20 years working in media, communications, brand, and content strategy, watching how work is changing from the inside. Each week on this podcast and the companion article, which I publish on Substack, I pick apart one topic that's reshaping work and what it means for you. This week, we're looking at a topic that's become kind of controversial for some reason, which I think is just insane because it really shouldn't be. It's empathy at work and whether or not it belongs in corporate workplaces. Let's get into it. So just starting with a bit of background. So I've posted about empathy at work on social media. I post about it quite a bit and also on my Substack. So I wrote an article a couple of months ago, which I can link in the show notes if you're interested in reading what I had to say about it back then. And, the thing is, I think most reasonable people, and I'm assuming that you are a reasonable person, as am I think most of us would agree that you should be empathetic at work in some form. I mean, we're humans at the end of the day, and empathy really just means being able to understand what another person's experience is. If you can't behave with empathy in most circumstances, my best advice would be potentially go get yourself checked out for an antisocial personality disorder because there might be something going on there. But surprisingly, every time I post about it on social media, without fail, there will be someone in the comments, at least one person in the comments, who jumps in with those usual talking points about, empathy doesn't belong at work and empathy is weakness, harden up, sunshine, and your boss isn't your mother or whatever it happens to be. And it just irritates me to no end because I just do not understand the logic of excluding empathy from like a big chunk of your day. I don't want to generalize too heavily because they may well be bots rather than actual people interacting with me on social media, but they always seem to come from a particular demographic when you open up their profile picture and have a look at them. And I won't say what demographic that is, but I'll leave you to guess. We probably can. At least one of them, though, I don't think this guy was a bot. He got really defensive when I recently posted something about empathy, and he claimed to be a fairly senior former executive from an S&P 500 company. He even mentioned what the company was, which makes me think this was potentially a somewhat clueless person who saw no problem with arguing with someone online with their former employer's name attached to it. But yeah, he was really adamant, this is what's destroying modern work and you can't come to work and expect empathy. That doesn't help the bottom line. If it was just one or two comments, I could just brush it off and say that's just some idiots doing what idiots do. But when you look a little deeper, it's actually not just one or two people making comments on social media. There's actually been quite a few books and articles and a whole school of thought written in recent times around empathy and how it can be destructive and a negative thing. So I'll give you an idea on some of the books that are out there. Just for full disclosure, I haven't read them. I don't intend to read them. I would get angry reading anything like this. But one of them is called Toxic Empathy by someone called Ali Beth Stuckey. So on her page, she actually bills herself as a Christian voice, which I find quite funny because I wonder what Jesus would make of someone who thinks empathy is toxic. And then you've got something called The Sin of Empathy by Joe Rigney. So these kinds of books, from what I can see, they cover a lot of ground and they have a bit of diversity among what they're saying. But the general sort of thrust of it is that empathy and too much empathy can make leaders weak. So to me, it's really disappointing to see this argument gaining traction in some corporate circles. I mean, I think we've made a lot of good progress in the last 20 years when it comes to, improving workplace culture and making work a little bit more human and, not inflicting psychological damage on people when they come to work. I wonder if we're not having a bit of a regression in that sense in recent times. I mean, I think of it this way. Organizations, yes, they have to make difficult decisions. Sometimes they have to restructure or, put people out of work. Not everyone always gets what they want. That is part of doing business. But here's what I think about people who like to downplay the importance of empathy at work. I don't think they get that empathy doesn't actually mean trying to keep everyone happy. That would actually be a terrible leadership quality if you spent your whole life trying to keep people happy. You can't do that ever. It's just a race to the bottom if you want to do that. But lots of these people seem to assume that, like, by default, empathy and good judgment and decisive leadership sit at opposite ends of the spectrum. And the thing is, they don't. And having to make difficult decisions should be something that's always done with some sort of empathetic lens on it. I actually think that empathy is one of the things that makes good judgment possible. Going a little further with that, I think people without sufficient levels of empathy should possibly be excluded from leadership. But we'll put a little pin in that one now and come back to it a little bit later. First, I think it's worthwhile to explore what empathy actually means. So If it doesn't mean keeping people happy or stopping people from being upset or avoiding conflict, then what is it really? So empathy at a really fundamental level is understanding another person's perspective. So that's all it is. It's not sympathy. It's very different from sympathy, where it means you're sad for someone or you feel sorry for someone. It's being able to appreciate what a person is thinking or feeling and why they might be thinking or feeling that way. And here's something really important to keep in mind. Empathy in itself is just a lens. It doesn't and it shouldn't dictate by itself what decision to make. So it gives you better and more complete information before you make it, but it doesn't make the decision for you. So let me give you a simple example of that, not from the world of work. So I'm a parent. I have a 10-year-old son. My son doesn't want to do a lot of things. So he doesn't want to go to school a lot of days. He doesn't want to eat broccoli a lot of days. He doesn't want to go to the dentist. He hates flu shots. So he doesn't want to do those things either, like a lot of kids, really. So as his mother and as an empathetic human being, I hope, I understand exactly why he feels like that. I understand that school can be overwhelming. I used to find it overwhelming too. And I understand that certain foods aren't that appealing and that chocolate would be yummier than broccoli. I understand that he doesn't want scary looking instruments in his mouth. That is all completely understandable from the perspective of a child. But the thing is that having that understanding of why he's feeling that way doesn't change the decision. He still goes to school most days. He still eats vegetables most days and he still goes to the dentist. We went 2 days ago. He wasn't happy, but we've done and we won't be back for 6 months now. So the thing is, my empathy hasn't disappeared because I've made a decision that he's going to find difficult or that he doesn't like. If anything, it's made me think more carefully about how I support him through it and how I explain to him why we do what we do and how I can make things more comfortable or appealing for him. So rather than the non-empathetic approach, which would be saying, I don't care, you're going and you're doing it anyway and yelling at him until he does it, I can explain why we're going and why it's in his interest to go and what we can do at the end that might be fun to offset some of the disappointment that he feels. And that's the difference between an empathetic approach and a not so empathetic approach. So when you think about it, leadership at work or any form of leadership probably isn't that different. So an empathetic leader might still have to make a tough decision to restructure a team or to let people go or to send people back to work after they've been working at home. They might have to reject an employee's request for something that they really want to do because they just don't really have the budget for it. So empathy doesn't prevent those decisions being made, but it does change how they're made and how the news of them is delivered and how the person or people on the other end of it are supported afterwards. So now I just want to put my own definition of empathy at work on the table. I see empathy as a fundamental leadership capability. It's the ability to understand the perspectives of the people affected by your decisions before you exercise your judgment. And call me crazy, but if you're tasked with making decisions that affect a lot of other people, you should be able to put yourself in their shoes and see what's happening from their viewpoint to make a balanced decision. And I'm not just talking about employees here, like often leaders will also impact customers and communities and shareholders and the millions of other stakeholders that float around an organisation. So if leaders can only make decisions with the understanding of one lens, which is the commercial lens or the shareholder lens, then you are never going to get a balanced set of decisions coming out of that organisation. So here's the thing I learned when I was in leadership roles. Leadership is more often than not about balancing competing interests. Empathy doesn't tell you which group should win. It helps you understand what each group stands to gain or lose before you decide. And it also helps you understand how to best manage the fallout and impact of whatever you decide. So if you take nothing else away from the time you spend with me today, I hope it's this. Empathy isn't a decision-making lever in itself. It's not a magical button that you push. It's an input into decision-making. So this brings me to something I find quite fascinating. So I'm a bit of a history nerd. I even studied Latin at high school, believe it or not. For what reason, I don't know why, but I did it. I actually do think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the past if we look back at what the people who have gone before us have done. And we actually only need to look back at history to understand the importance of empathy in decision-making and that some of the best leaders in history were, by all accounts, quite empathetic people. History really teaches us that the current idea that empathetic leaders can't make tough decisions for the greater good is really just, to be honest, rubbish. In fact, if empathy made leaders weak, our history would look very different. Now, if you're in the US or anywhere around the world, really, you will know this name. You don't have to look any further than Abraham Lincoln. So by almost every contemporary account of Lincoln, he was extraordinarily empathetic. So he spent a lot of time trying to understand people he disagreed with, including his political opponents, which we don't see a lot of these days. He was also known for seeing multiple sides of an argument, which is the definition of empathy. At the same time, he led the US through one of the bloodiest civil wars in history because he believed that's what had to happen to preserve the Union and to abolish slavery as well. So his empathy didn't make him indecisive. It gave him a better understanding and a more fulsome understanding of what was at stake. Or if you're on the other side of the world, closer to my home, take Jacinda Ardern. So if you don't know who she is, she's the former New Zealand Prime Minister of a few years back. Whatever your politics, it's hard to argue that she lacked empathy, I would say. In fact, her prime ministership was probably defined by her response to the 2019 terrorist attacks in Christchurch, where I think around 50 Muslims were killed in a mosque. So her response has been heralded as a global example of compassionate leadership. So at the same time as showing that compassionate leadership, so she was going around and meeting with the Islamic community and, saying all the right things and acting with great compassion. But at the same time she was doing that, she was also acting really swiftly and decisively. Her government within weeks passed legislation banning certain semi-automatic weapons, which is no easy thing to do in any sort of parliamentary system. And then during the pandemic, so during COVID, she's known for one of, having the toughest responses to COVID. And it was probably the hardest moment of her political career, I'm going to say. So she went hard on lockdowns and border closures and restrictions that affected millions of people. And those decisions were not popular at the time with lots of people. Some people supported them, but lots of people were just not happy with her. So whether or not you agree with that, the point is that if she'd worried about keeping everyone happy, she wouldn't have been able to make those decisions. And the proof in the pudding is that, New Zealand had one of the lowest casualty rates from COVID in those early days. So empathy didn't prevent her making tough decisions, but it affected how she communicated them and how she managed the human impact from them. And look, this is just two examples. So history is full of leaders who were both compassionate and decisive, people who were able to make tough decisions when needed and then manage the fallout afterwards. So what this is to say is that empathy isn't what stops leaders from making difficult decisions. It's what helps them understand the consequences before they make them. Okay, so that probably brings us to what I'd say is the so what factor of this episode. If you've listened this far, chances are I'm preaching to the choir anyhow. You probably agree that empathy is just as important as any other skill in our corporate leadership. I do want you to walk away from this episode with some new food for thought. So how about this? If I'm right about empathy being a critical tool for decision making, then this has implications far beyond anything that I've said so far today. It actually means that empathy isn't a nice to have. It's a core leadership capability. It's not about soft skills and touchy-feelies and keeping people feeling happy and avoiding conflict at work. It's about making better and more balanced decisions as a leader. Every day corporate leaders are asked to make decisions that affect other people's lives: hiring, promotions, restructures, performance reviews, investments, new technology, RTO policies, all that stuff. None of it happens in a vacuum. All these decisions, they affect people like you and me in real ways. Even if we don't work for the organisation, often they will affect us too. And if someone lacks the ability or even the willingness to understand those different perspectives before making a decision, why should we see that as a leadership strength? I mean, we spend so much time assessing corporate leaders on their commercial acumen. Are they strategic? Do they read a balance sheet? Do they have operational experience? Of course, that is all really important if you're appointing someone to a leadership role. But I'd argue that we should place just as much value on a leader's ability to understand people whose lives they're about to change. I mean, every decision is made with incomplete information. I know that from experience. You never have all the facts. And the thing is, empathy can actually help you fill some of those gaps. So it reveals risks that you might otherwise miss, and it can highlight consequences that you hadn't thought of. It forces you to consider perspectives that aren't naturally your own. And that's not weakness. I think it's actually due diligence for leaders. And if you don't have that skill set, should you really be in that role? I mean, there's evidence that in many cases, the right people are not being selected for leadership roles. There's some research suggesting that around 20% of corporate leaders display psychopathic tendencies. It's a similar figure to what you see in prison populations. I just want to say that research is debated, and it's worth interpreting it really carefully. But if it's even remotely accurate, it raises some really uncomfortable questions for companies who are appointing leaders. So one of the defining characteristics of any antisocial personality disorder is a profound lack of empathy. If we're promoting people into leadership who fundamentally struggle to understand the perspectives and viewpoints of others, perhaps the problem isn't that organisations have become too heavy on empathy. far more likely that we've been putting the wrong people in key roles. So one final thought for today's episode. Like it or not, companies are social organisms. They're communities of people working together towards a common goal. Every decision that's made by a leader, it changes relationships, it changes incentives, it changes trust and behaviour. So why would we deliberately place people in charge who struggle to understand the human consequences of those decisions? I genuinely do not understand that logic. If organisations are social systems, which they are, empathy cannot be seen as a luxury. It's one of the competencies that helps those systems function and flourish in a healthy way. You know, we'd never promote someone into leadership who couldn't understand a balance sheet. Perhaps we should be equally hesitant to promote people who can't understand other people. Now, if this episode sparked something for you, I've explored the idea in more depth in this week's companion article on Track Changes On. Whether you're listening on Substack, YouTube, or through your favourite podcast app, you can find the full piece in the publication, which is linked in the show notes. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. If you'd like more conversations about the future of work, AI, and careers, subscribe for weekly updates. Until next time, take care.